Hi BookTube, and welcome to a new video. So my last video was my mid-year freakout tag, in which I left you on a bit of a cliffhanger, whereby I said that Elena Knows by Claudio Pinheiro was my best read of the first half of the year, which it was, but it had been supplanted by a read within the first week of July. I didn't mean it to be a cliffhanger, but I've had COVID since then, that having outrun it for 2 years and 4 months, I finally succumbed. I wasn't really able to focus enough to read all that much. The only books I read, I need to test again today. I tested positive, although very faintly, a couple of days ago. So the only books I've been able to read in the 8 days were some lesbian poetry and 2 classic sci-fi books. Make of that what you will. I will be talking about those 3. So a lot of the books I'm going to talk about today were right from the beginning of the month that I just haven't had a chance to talk about. And those are Bennett, Lord of Dark Places, Audrey Magee, The Colony, the Geometer Lobachevsky by Adrian Duncan, Emergency by Daisy Hilyard. I'm going to call it C+nto. I'm not sure whether it is or not, but let's not get the video flagged. C+nto and Other Poems by Joelle Taylor. The 2 sci-fi books, Alfred, the Demolished Man, and Greg Bear, Blood Music, both in the sci-fi Masterworks series. And finally, Postmortem for a Postmodernist by Arthur Asa Berger. So I'm going to start with Bennett, Lord of Dark Places. So this book was sent to me by one of my subscribers called Bob Black. And this is one of his favourite books of all time, if not his favourite. And I can see why. I think it's a very ebullient, effusive read. I will say from the outset that if you're of a sensitive disposition, there's all sorts of things that are going to upset you, so lots of trigger warnings. I mean, in the first few pages we have a lynching, we have incest, we have child sexual abuse, and it pretty much continues in that vein throughout. I want to talk about this book side by side with Percival Everett's The Trees, because they're both these sort of very over the top satires, but I think they take different paths as they move on. So Joe Market is an 8-year-old boy in the deep south whose mother is literally screwed to death by his father. His father comes to find him by the river to announce this fact. He doesn't tell him the cause of death, he just says your mother has died, and then proceeds to sexually abuse Joe, the 8-year-old Joe. The father hits upon a money-making scheme of founding a new religion, whereby he will be the preacher and Joe will be this naked child. It's called something like the Church of the Naked Virgin or the Naked Child or something. And Joe is prodigiously well hung even at 8 years old. In a way, this book I've never seen the film Forrest Gump, but obviously by osmosis I've sort of absorbed what Forrest Gump is. And in a way, Joe Market is a sort of Forrest Gump figure, and instead of having the prodigious powers of running, he has prodigious sexual stamina. And obviously, this scam of the sort of religion is very successful, and they're sort of living the life of Riley. And the dad gets a bit sort of jealous because Joe sort of is getting all the sexual attention, both from men and women, but also that they're in a car one day and there's a group of white lads, and Joe is sort of such a victim of trauma and abuse that he's willing to give himself to these boys, which seems to be what they're sort of demanding, and his father is appalled by that. So he's going to take Joe down. So they've got a religious meeting. The father secretly calls the cops in advance, saying there's going to be this sort of nudity on show, but it turns out that the cops also arrest the father because he's had a sort of a brain fart and given a very radical sermon preaching on race, and the cops object to that, and they arrest the father. Joe escapes, makes his way up to the north, and the bulk of the story takes place for the adult Joe in the north, I think in New Jersey. As I say, up to this point, there's been a lot about sort of, sex, sexual abuse, race. It covers it all in a very satirical way, in much the same way as I say, as Percival Everett's The Trees does. But then I think the books diverge. With The Trees, I think Everett slightly dials down the satire and concentrates on plot in order to develop his themes, and he stays in control of it. Whereas here, I feel that once we get to the adult Joe, that the control of the first part, about the first third or 2/5, is lost, and it becomes much more episodic, much more set piece. And I feel that the character of Joe Market is a very inconsistent character, because he's not the brightest tool in the box in the first part, and that all works. In the second part, he's basically busted with his pimp in the north by a white Italian cop, who Joe makes this sort of, I've had nothing in my life, I've had terrible upbringing, is it hardly surprising I fall into this life of crime, pricks the cop's conscience, and the cop says, okay, well, I'm going to send you to school then to complete your education, and if you fall off the school wagon, then I'm going to bust you. So Joe does get an education of sorts, so he has risen from what he was in the first part of the book, but within that, there, emotionally, because he's so traumatically abused, he's not an intelligent man. Intellectually, he's a bit more so because of his schooling and absorbing sort of politics of the time. We're in the early 60s by now. But I just felt some of the episodes were just nonplussing, really. So his white Italian friend says that he's sort of fed up with life. He's going to sign on for the Vietnam War. He's going to sign on as a soldier, knowing that he'll probably get sent to Vietnam, and he wants Joe to join him because they're best buds. Joe says, yep, that's fine. When it's time to go to the recruitment office, the white guy has I think he's either lost his nerve or he's been failed on a medical reason. I can't remember. Anyway, so he's not joining up. So Joe now decides he has to find somebody else. So then he goes on this caper to, basically rope in an associate who he finds in a bar. And in order to rope in his associate, he's got to make him feel an undying debt to Joe. So they go and steal a turkey in order to present to this guy's mother, and then they go and sign up together. So that in itself is a bit of a bizarre set piece. And then we have the whole Vietnam bit, which it just didn't read as part of who Joe was to me. And within that, then we get a very poignant death scene of a black officer that Joe witnesses and stuff. But I felt the book ran out of a bit of steam in the sort of second half. Too many set pieces that didn't really join up together. Too much of the continued abuse, and all every character that sets eyes on Joe sort of wants to have him or be had by him sexually, and in the end you do get a bit concussed by it. Or reminded me very much of Robert Coover's Lucky Pierre, which is a story set in the world of porn, and it's just a lot of sex scenes, and that's here too. So it did drop off a bit for me in the second. I mean, I think that first third or 2/5 is brilliant. Satire at the level of Percival Everett's The Trees. But the second half, I felt he didn't maintain the discipline. We got more of the same, and we got a lot more sort of disjointed set piece scenes. So I give this 3.5 stars, going up to 4. And on to Audrey Magee's The Colony. This is the book of which I spake. This is the book that has knocked Eleanor Knowes off its perch as my favourite read of the year. Emotionally, this is almost to the level of Valeria Luiselli's The Lost Children Archive. It's that good. So it starts off with an English painter from the mainland England, who is in a sort of coracle run by this Irish guy, because he's going to go over to a remote island in the Irish Sea to paint its bleak and rugged landscape. And the opening dialogue is really laconic quite terse, because he goes, come on, let's go, and the guy goes, no, we have to wait, without ever explaining why. And it's very sort of, polite. The Irish guy is very polite, but there's no deference in it. There's actually quite a lot of subversion underneath it, because he won't tell him why. And it turns out that they're waiting for a second guy because they need a second oarsman. On this, while they're in port and while once they get going, the English guy is sort of literally doing this, sort of taking snapshots in his mind of scenes that he's going to paint or could paint. And they're also referred to as self-portrait, artist this, self-portrait, artist that. And straight away he's colonising everything he sees to make himself the centre of it. It's literally through his eyes, but it's going to be reproduced as it's the only frame of reference, it's the only perspective, as if he's God. Or more what reminds me of when God gives Adam in the Garden of Eden the power to name all the animals. It's very much like this, hence the colony. It's not an artist colony. He's the only artist going to this underpopulated island. There's a colony of seals, but he is colonial in his attitudes all the way through. So he gets to the island, which he's paid for, a cottage to live there and stuff. And there are very few people living on this island. We only really see an extended family, of which the main characters are the great-grandmother, who doesn't speak English at all, to her great-grandson James, who speaks perfect English and becomes his sort of guide and sort of, fetcher and things like that. And James's mother, and then there's James's grandmother, who's probably the one that's least developed. And then we have another character who's a Frenchman, who's a sociolinguist, who has come to fight the good fight to preserve the language of the great-grandmother from going into extinction as each subsequent generation employs more and more English. The English language is colonising the Irish language. And he and this artist have sort of furious fights over the dinner table about, the English artist goes, well, if that's what they want, and if that's a road to progress and continued employment, why fight that? And this guy's going, no, it's the soul of the people, it's our identity and it's civilization. But this French guy, who's seemingly on the side of the islanders, is no less colonial, because he keeps calling James, the boy, Seamus, and James keeps correcting and going, no, my name's James. So again, this very sort of subversive, laconic dialogue is just fantastically done. But what it is also is a character study. We get the study, obviously, the Englishman, the Frenchman. We also get of James, and we get James's mother. And in a way, they're the two main characters. James, his mother is a widow because her husband, brother, and father were all killed in a fishing disaster when the boat went down. She holds a candle. She knows they're dead, but she feels she can never leave the island in case her husband returns. So there's that sort of cognitive dissonance or emotional dissonance. She knows he's never going to come back, but equally she feels absolutely tied to the island in case he does, and she doesn't want to miss that. But as part of that feeling of being trapped, she gives herself to the artist to become his model, his life model. Because she's had a look at some of the books he bought with him by Gauguin or on Gauguin and other artists, and she communes with this woman that Gauguin froze in time from 150 years ago, however long it is, that woman is still alive, and that's what she wants for herself, that her actual physical life is sort of dead because she's trapped, but she can live beyond that through being memorialised and immortalised in art. So she happily gives herself to the English guy, but it's absolutely never sexual. For her, it's about immortality. For him, for the artist, this is going to reignite his career that has somewhat stalled. Now, James, the son, is the guy who's hanging around the artist the most, and he wants to escape the island. He wants to go over to the mainland, to England, where he speaks English stuff, because he's criticised by his family because he's the only man of the family left, and they expect him to go out fishing. He doesn't want to do that. It's not just a sort of a being scared because his father died. It's much more profound than that. He imagines himself smelling a fish. He can't get the smell of himself with fish out of his nose. And what he wants, what he responds to, is the smell of the paints and the pigments and the turpentine, all this stuff that the artist brings. And James starts painting, sort of under the guidance of the English guy. It's pretty reluctant, because he wants these paints to banish and purge the smell of the paint of the fish for him, but also provide him a means of escape. That he and the Englishman concoct this idea they'll have a joint exhibition, because they're both painting the same thing of sights on the island. So that it'll provide him an escape to England. And his mother is knitting him a fisherman's jersey, because they're very practical, whether you're a fisherman or not, they're very practical items of clothing on a remote, cold, windswept island. And there's a tragic scene where the mother sort of is talking about the jumper's nearly finished, and James goes, well, I'll wear it to my first exhibition in London as my one link with home, my one link with you, mother, and my dead father. Not realising, of course, that such a jumper would just make him stand out a mile in trendy London. They're completely unaware of it, but he's responding to it as this sort of emotional link to his home. And yet, if he ever did wear it in London, it would absolutely crucify him, lead him to be absolutely slaughtered by the artist. And that's pretty much it. I don't want to go beyond that because of spoilers and stuff, but it's just beautifully written. We have really beautifully crafted characters that we can absolutely empathise with. I will say, in a way, maybe the French guy's backstory is the least engaging. That he is the son of an Algerian mother and a French military father who obviously met during the Algerian conflict. Lots of conflict at home. The mother is trying to preserve the Arabic side of his identity, and get him to secretly learn in an Arabic-speaking school, which he was not interested in. And one of the things the Englishman accuses him of is, well, why don't you go and preserve your Algerian Arabic dialect? Why are you over here? Doing it for the Irish. It's slightly less. I don't think Magee is quite as on sure ground writing about French and Algeria as she is about Ireland and Britain or England. But even that aside, I just thought this was just a supreme piece of writing that utterly engaged me, engaged my emotions, gave me some wonderful character work, and every observation was just pitch perfect. There's a lot about art and making art and the materials of making art in here. I don't know if Magee has a background in art herself, but it read utterly convincing to me, as though she did, that she was an artist, a visual artist herself. Anyway, 5 stars. And then for some reason, I wanted to read something else Irish immediately after. I bought this in a bookshop about a couple of months ago, the Geometer Lobachevsky, the bookseller, because I bought a couple of books, and the bookseller said, oh, this is brilliant. This is the one he picked on. And it's perfectly serviceable. It's nowhere near as good as Magee, even though it's in a similar remote, windswept part of Ireland. But it's good. So it's set in the 1950s. Ireland is not electrified. Very few parts of Ireland are electrified. And Lobachevsky is a Soviet geologist, the great-grandson of a hugely influential and important Russian mathematician. Lobachevsky, the grandson, has not picked up he hasn't inherited the guy's mind, and he knows that he's a very low-level functionary, and that's recognised by the Soviet state that he's not going to live up to the promise that they hoped. So they give him these sort of jobs. So he's on secondment in Ireland, observing this group of Irish geologists who are trying to plot the heights of land in order to have electrical pylons. But this land is bogland, so it keeps shifting. The water table keeps shifting the heights. It's a really difficult assignment to survey it. And Lobachevsky is there ostensibly to to observe. But he offers a couple of solutions. And the interesting part of the first part of this book is that there's lots of tension that is deliberately by the author, never resolved. There are two instances where Lobachevsky offers solutions. The first one is he's in the pub with the surveyors and other people, and he's trying to offer a solution of how they can deal with this shifting water table. So he's got his threads out and he's asking this guy to stand over there, we'll hold the thread that way, guy to stand just outside the window of the pub to hold the thread that way. So there's this sort of cat's cradle of stuff to help survey the land. And he's sort of trying to, make sure that he's got all angles covered. When a huge storm hits and the guy outside rushes into the dry, and he's just thereby, the whole thing with all these threads so carefully calibrated is destroyed. And that's one example of what I mean by he never quite is enabled to do provide a solution. There's another one where they realise that the poles that they've nailed into the bog are inaccurate. They've shifted. Lobachevsky says, okay, well, we don't have to sort of pull them all out and redo them again. What we can do is alter the level of shift by hammering a nail into each stake to correct for the slippage. And they do this, and then they're going to come back and then start triangulating the next day. But again, there's the storm and the lightning. These serves as lightning rods, all these metal nails, and the stakes are struck by lightning and split in two. And so again, he's foiled. So that's part one, and I found it really interesting. I love that metaphor of just ratcheting up the tension and deliberately denying the reader satisfaction and resolution. In part one, he's got a letter from the Soviet Union recalling him, and he thinks this is a death sentence because this is still the era of Stalin, that a couple of his mates have suffered in the purges. His grandfather or great-grandfather's name had always protected him, but now he seems to have become surplus to requirements, and he feels that it's a death sentence. So he goes into hiding in really remote island, on an island in an estuary, and he meets up with a family there who have their own sort of quest, really. There's this boulder that's just so big and sort of powerful that they want to break it up. I can't remember why now, but there's a reason for them breaking it up. But it resists sledgehammers and hammering with a nail and all of that. So they pack it in peat, and they're burning the peat to raise the temperature, and then they're going to put seawater on it, and they think that the massive change in temperature is going to crack the rock open. So a lot of this section is about that and about the various. Again, it's an extended family, and Lobachevsky's interactions with them. By now, he's pretending to be Polish and stuff. But he's always looking over his shoulder as well. And this was less satisfying. I did like the idea of this quest of smashing the rock and stuff, but the rest of the stuff around it was a lot less interesting. And then we go into the final part of the book, which again I won't spoil. So there was much to admire here, but ultimately the parts were greater than the whole, I felt. So I gave it 3.5. And on to Daisy Hilyard's Emergency. So I'm going to read the blurb here. Stuck at home under lockdown, a woman recounts her 1990s childhood in rural Yorkshire. I would say that the notion of stuck in lockdown represents less than 3% of this book. So actually it is all about recollection of her childhood in Yorkshire. It is solid text for 97% of the book. I'm not interested in childhood reminiscences. I'm particularly not interested in pastoral scenes, even if they are slightly dark. I mean, the message of this book seems to be nature is cruel and man is crueler. Like, duh. So we get stuff about foxes, kestrels hunting voles, toads, moss growing in dead trees, de blah, de blah, de blah, de blah. Very uninvolving to someone like me who's just not really interested in these descriptions and observations. I mean, is the author trying to anthropomorphise it to make points about human relationships? There is a bit about sort of the global nature and connectivity of agriculture. There's a quarry in her village, and it's quarried for stuff that gets shipped to China for use in their sort of building boom. But again, it's not really very convincing. It's not really upfront enough to make a point. And for a book called Emergency, there's a curious lack of urgency. I really did not enjoy this at all. 2.5 stars. C+nto and Other Poems by Joelle Taylor. So this is a book of lesbian poetry, specifically butch lesbian, which is what Joelle Taylor identifies as. She is harking back to a time where there were important institutions and clubs and bars, this type of thing in London, which served both as a refuge for violence on the street against them. Darling, why are you dressed up as a man, and all this sort of catcalls and violence, but also a harbour and a refuge, but also a beacon to find like-minded people. And Joelle Taylor is recollecting these because they've all disappeared. As London moves on and changes and everything, all these haunts have gone. And there's a lot of imagery about vitrine, the glass, preservation under glass, like in a museum, and that's what this book partly serves as. It's brilliantly written. I'm just going to read you. And now, 23, you finish rehearsals in the city with nowhere to sleep. The posh kids wish you good night, and you walk and you walk and you walk, and he finds you quickly. And when you come around, you are empty. His eyes are full and above you, twin gods. He slips into small boy sleep, thumbs slotted in jukebox mouth. And this is the first time you think you are going to be killed. And when you are not, it is a disappointment. The morning after pill is a communion wafer, and you are forgiven your trespasses. Brilliant, stunning writing. I gave this 4.5 stars. And on to the 2 sci-fi books. Alfred Bester's The Demolished Man and Greg Bear, Blood Music. As I say, this is all I could really bring my mind to focus on when COVID had rather removed my mind. I felt most sort of otherworldly during it. The Demolished Man. So our solar system has become capitalised and corporatised. There are 2 huge financial corporations run by individuals who are in competition with each other, and they basically have carved up the solar system. Earth is the only other thing, sci-fi element or futuristic element I would add, is that there is a group of telepathic people who can read minds, and these are highly prized and highly paid and obviously work for these 2 corporations. But what it does mean is it's impossible to commit murder, because even if you form the idea of and the motive of committing murder, a telepath will see and you'll be nicked before you even do the act. So there is no murder basically on Earth. However, one of the heads of the corporation has decided he's going to kill the other one, and knows that he has to set up this rather elaborate and I think well done scheme of events that he plots in order to throw off possible being found out, even if he commits the murder. If someone empaths him, they'll see in his mind that he's done it. So one of the things he does is he goes and gets an earworm and plants that in his head, and that manages to block out being read. There's a lot of interesting stuff there. The problem is he commits the murder, and then we get the police investigation led by an empath to unravel it, and we get all the details which we already know because the murder's been described to us, how it's accomplished. We get them unraveled one by one, so that's repetition. And then we get the battle of the empath versus this guy, because they both know that each is onto the other one. And then it's a battle literally of minds and wills. And towards the end, it does get very interesting in how the policeman employs a strategy to break down the other guy, where basically he alters his reality through telepathy. And I thought that was really, really interesting. But then, so we know the means and the opportunity. The motive is the thing that's troubling, and we get after this sort of breakdown of this guy, we get the motive, and it's really trite psychological characterization, which I did not think was worthy of what had just come before, of the breaking down, which I thought was psychologically very interesting. This was very trite, very sort of Freudian and stuff. And then we get the super ending, which is what being a demolished man actually entails. And it's a bit like that extra chapter in Anthony Burgess's The Clockwork Orange. It seems completely gratuitous and you don't need it. So there were good bits in here, but a lot of stuff that was pretty unengaging. And the problem I have with both of these is that they're not page turners. They really aren't. You know, they're describing stuff rather than giving you stuff that you know, to drive you on. It's just description that you have to plough through. But I gave this 3 stars. This, unfortunately, I gave 2 stars because it was even less engaging. At least this had some real sort of good bits that picked up the sort of ideational content, the quality, and also got, you know, were page turners. This was just description. So a man is working in a biogenetics lab. He's got a bit maverick. He's doing work in his own time in the evenings. He's basically gets canned. He needs to get his work out there, but he knows that he's going to be searched and stuff. So what he does is he basically injects himself with his own samples. And he was working on cell communication between cellular level and the whole human being. And by planting these cells, these genetically modified cells inside him, they start exhibiting intelligence and absorbing him and his ideas and understanding about the human race. He goes, you know, he's canned, he goes back home, and this stuff is taking him over. And the thing is that it's about sort of collectivity of instead of being about the individual human body mind unit, it's about the collective intelligence of all cells in a body, and therefore they colonize humankind in America. It's spread like a virus, although it isn't a virus technically. It's just been up this huge colony of human beings who no longer need their bodies. And it's confined to America. America's put under quarantine by the rest of the world. One of the guys at the lab manages to fly himself out in a private plane to Germany to a specialist isolation labs so they can study him because he's been infected, as it were. And that's pretty much it. There are some interesting ideas about the individual versus collectivity. It's something I've written about in my own book, Three Dreams in the Key of G. And it offers different models of political organisation from what we currently have in the way cells coordinate and collaborate. But the problem with this book is that the main third section introduces a whole load of new characters, ostensibly people who are not affected by the virus. So there's a young girl who is self-described as slow. I don't mean she's mentally challenged, but she describes herself as slow, not very intuitive, not very curious. We get the mother of patient 0, who was suspicious about his behaviour. She hooks up with two brothers who seem to be unaffected. So we have these other characters, plus the guy in the isolation ward in Germany. And we go from 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 and back again. But the slow girl is not very engaging because she's slow. You know, one thinks of David Markson's Wittgenstein's Mistress, and the gap between that character, effectively a solipsistic narrative, and this girl, solipsistic narrative, is a country mile. The mother and the two guys, their story stops and is not resolved. They just sort of disappear from the book, which is odd. And the guy in Germany sort of repeats what happened to patient 0. His I've become a god. You know, these cells regard me as a god because I gave them life, this, that, and the other. Yeah, this just didn't work for me on any level. 2 stars. And finally, Postmortem for a Postmodernist by Arthur A. Berger. It's kind of hard to describe what this is. This is sort of an academic guide to postmodernism, a bit like that. I don't know if you remember that series, Philosophy for Idiots or Hegel for Idiots or whatever. This is not dissimilar. It's a very gentle way into postmodernism. It's done as a novel where a famous postmodernist is hosting a dinner party to put together this huge conference and all these other guests. He ends up dead when the lights go out, and then the policeman interviews each of the guests, and in that way we get as I say, a very nice gentle introduction into postmodernism. It's fun, it's a quick read, it's not heavy. I mean, I'm not sure I can rate it really, because it's a very different type of book. I was interested in the fact that it was a novel done to introduce these themes, and I enjoyed it, but I'm not going to rate it because it is a novel, but it's not what you call a novel really. So there you have it. I think that was 8 books in all, including, yay, my new favourite book of the year so far, including one of the worst, Emergency, including 2 of my science fiction titles. I've finally, having sat on these books for God knows how many years, got round to reading them. I don't feel particularly enriched by the experience, but hey ho. So I'm currently reading my 3rd Gina Apostel novel this year. I should have brought it in with me, but that has started off brilliantly. It's all about wordplay, right up my street, but more once I've finished it. Hopefully I will be able to get back to normal reading. Today's Sunday, so hopefully tomorrow I can get back to normal reading, getting back to that book. And then see what delights we've got for August. Okay, till next time. Thanks very much.